Well, that was a struggle, believe me. It took 2 years to find the right title, and now we're struggling to get a title in French, which is even worse. But so we don't have a title in French. But Get the Picture is an active title, and my editor came up with it. It's a picture by David Turnley, who happened to have won a Pulitzer Prize for his work in South Africa. It's in South Africa, and the photographer you see is Jim Nachtwey of Magnum, who's probably today's most celebrated photographer. He's won the Robert Capa Award of the Overseas Press Club 3 times, and you don't get that easily. Robert Capa was perhaps the most famous war photographer of all time. Many people have now seen a new movie called Saving Private Ryan, which is based on the landing on Omaha Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944. And I was the editor of Bob Capa's pictures of the real thing. He was my colleague at Life magazine. No, his real name was Andre Friedman. He was born in Budapest and took the name Capa because it was short and good in almost any language. Well, there's 6 cities in my life. I grew up in Chicago. I've worked mostly in New York, but I spent a year in Los Angeles. I've worked in Washington for several years, and during the war I lived and worked in London, and now I live in Paris. Started out with Life magazine all through World War II. That's where I got my basic training. And then I became picture editor of Ladies' Home Journal, executive editor of Magnum Photos, which is an international cooperative picture agency and with offices now in 4 cities. And then I got into newspapers, first the Washington Post and finally the New York Times. And when I went to Paris 15 years ago, I cooked up a job as Paris correspondent for the National Geographic Paris. I was always a picture editor. I was kind of a lazy writer, and I became comfortable working with pictures, and especially with photographers. Photographers are kind of like children, and I've known so many photographers, I feel as though I have children all over the world. I'm afraid it's me. That's the kind of thing I did as a young reporter for Life magazine, and that was taken in California right after Pearl Harbor. And it was a lighthearted story intended to show how soldiers shoot craps. It never ran. I was the London picture editor for Life, and there were 6 Life photographers assigned to cover D-Day. The one we counted on the most was Robert Capa, who had so much experience in covering wars. He had covered the Spanish War, the war in China, the war in North Africa and Italy. So we all looked to Capa, and indeed he volunteered to land with the first wave on Omaha Beach. It was Tuesday, June 6, 1944 was D-Day, and we waited all day Tuesday for pictures, and we waited all day Wednesday. But where were the pictures? Where was Capa? Finally, Wednesday evening, a courier came into the Life office with 4 rolls of film from Capa and a handwritten note saying, "John, that's where the action is." So I told the darkroom to rush me contact prints for editing. We were under terrible deadline pressure. The whole world was waiting for our pictures because we had to pool our pictures with the wire services. So a few minutes later, a young darkroom lad came rushing into my office, almost hysterical. He said, "John, the pictures are ruined." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're in such a damn rush. I put them in the drying cabinet, and the heat got them. I closed the doors, which wasn't normal, and there was too much heat, and the emulsion ran." So I went back to the darkroom with him and looked at the pictures, the rolls one at a time, and there was just nothing on the first 3 rolls. But on the 4th roll, there were 11 discernible images, and that's one of them. Well, it was the lead picture and the lead story in Life magazine. That picture was wired throughout the world by AP, UP. It does. Life published a caption under it saying it was slightly out of focus because of the photographer's excitement or something like that. Actually, the light level was so low that there was just no depth of field. I mean, he had to shoot very, very slow, and of course, I don't think it had anything to do with the darkroom accident that looks that way. I think my recollection is that I printed 11 that night. We had to print everything 4 times to go through censorship. I think there are 9 images that survive now in the archives. The other 2 probably were inconsequential. That is Capa himself at the racetrack in Paris, and it's a picture by his friend and my colleague also, Henri Cartier-Bresson, a very famous French photographer. And when I landed in Paris after joining Magnum in 1953, the first thing Bob did was to take me to Longchamp, to the racetrack, to place some bets. And as it turned out, I won and he lost that day. Well, I became kind of a member of his family. I met him first in 1939 during a lull in his war coverage. He was in New York, and he came to see the editors at Life, and I was a young reporter on the Life staff. And he had a kind of a sly look to him. I mean, he was, we were roughly the same age. Bob was about 3 years older, but such different people. But you know, me from the south side of Chicago and Bob from Pest, Budapest, and but we hit it off. I remember taking him skating on the Rockefeller Center rink where we used to go at lunch hour, and the first thing he did, because he couldn't really skate, was to grab onto the arm of the prettiest girl on the rink, and it was fine, except they took a spectacular spill right in front of the executive lunch windows where some of Time Inc.'s executives were lunching, and they got a big kick out. Anyway, Bob was a lot of fun. He was charming. Women fell for him. He had a long affair with Ingrid Bergman just after the war. That one ended rather sadly. She writes about it in her memoirs. But, well, that's a picture of Ingrid Bergman taken by another Magnum photographer named David Seymour, whom we nicknamed Shim, because his Polish name was totally unpronounceable. I can't even do it. But Ingrid was living in Rome. That's one of the twins she had by Rossellini. And Shim became a friend of hers. And tragically, he died a short time after that picture was taken because he was killed at the day after the Suez War ended in 1956. Well, that was one of the saddest days of my life. I told you I was Bob Capa's editor on D-Day, but that was June 6, 1944. But 10 years later, May 25th, 1954, Bob accepted an assignment for Life magazine to cover the French War in Indochina. I didn't want him to go. I had to offer it to him. I was the executive editor of Magnum and made such arrangements. I telephoned to him in Tokyo and said, you know, don't go. It's not our war. But he said, don't worry, I'll be back soon. But on May 25th, 2 weeks later, he stepped on a landmine and died instantly. So when his film came in, I had his very last frame printed with the sprocket holes and everything, the black border around it. And as a kind of testament to this really tremendous photographer, one of the truly greats of the 20th century. And I also had to help the family make funeral arrangements. We had a memorial service and the Quaker meeting in Amawalk, New York, in Purchase, New York, and then buried him in a little Quaker cemetery. And as we were putting him in the ground, a young photographer came up, and one of the family members said to me, John, this is a private moment. And I said, okay, but look whom we're burying. The photographer was Dirk Halstead, who now lives here in Washington and works for Time magazine. Well, that's a photograph by Eugene Smith, whose nickname in the war was Wonderful Smith. He was famous in the Pacific for his war coverage. He finally was wounded on Okinawa. He'd been a colleague of mine at Life magazine from 1939 on. And he joined Magnum after quitting Life in 1955. And when the Andrea Doria sank, I persuaded Gene to come into New York and work through the night with me. He would only do it if I stayed with him because he was afraid he'd fall asleep. And as we waited on the docks for the survivors of the sunken ship to come to land, Gene noticed this nun holding a teddy bear, hoping that it would welcome a child. And it's a curious picture. It's sort of an odd way to report that story, but it's a picture that has lived in photo history. Well, what do you think of when you think of a shipwreck? You think of people waving from the survivors, glad to be alive. This woman isn't a survivor, she's just greeting, she's there. But the anxiety in her face, the beauty of the face is what gives it its quality. I'll never forget, we stood on the pier with other news photographers, and I was really ashamed of the press on that occasion, because these survivors from the Andrea Doria were landing on the Ile, they came back on the Ile-de-France, and as the ship drew up to the pier, the news photographer said, "Hey, wave, wave," you know, which I thought was terrible, because these people felt, I mean, they were glad to be alive, of course, but it was such a synthetic way to report the occasion. Yeah, sadly, my generation of Life magazine is just disappearing so fast. I went yesterday in New York to a luncheon of the Time Life Alumni Society, and there wasn't a single Life photographer there from my era, not one. Well, I've been a journalist all my life, a picture editor all my life, but I've worked on daily deadlines, weekly deadlines, monthly deadlines. But a book is kind of the toughest of all. I didn't realize how hard it would be. I just felt I had to do it to kind of sort out my life. And it took me 8 years, a long time. It was 3 years since Random House accepted it. Cutting it. I had more to say, and there's always, you know, but books have to be cut. Anything has to be edited. I respect that. And I had a good relationship with my editor. But that was the toughest part, what to leave out. George Roger, a British member of Magnum, one of the founders of Magnum. Magnum was was formed to avoid it was formed so that photographers could control their own destinies. And it was formed in 1947, and I was Magnum's first and best American customer as picture editor of Ladies' Home Journal until Bob Capa came to New York in Christmas '52 and persuaded me to join Magnum. It meant taking a salary cut, but he was a good salesman, and I agreed. Roger had been one of the founders. The others were Cartier-Bresson, Capa himself, and David Seymour, whom I mentioned. And then we were joined by some very talented photographers from other countries, Werner Bischoff from Switzerland, Ernst Haas from Vienna, and of course there was an American group. The notable one whom I was somewhat responsible for bringing in was a young guy named Elliot Irwit. It's incredible, but Magnum still survives. Many of Magnum's best customers, like Life magazine, the weekly, have perished, but Magnum goes on. Well, Werner was to the left, perhaps. None of them were party line people at all, but Capa, Cartier-Bresson, and Shem came out of pre-war Paris, when there was a great struggle between left and right. The Popular Front was on the left, and there was a somewhat strong French fascist party, which we tend to forget, on the right. And so the sympathies of Capa and Cartier-Bresson and Shem were certainly on the left at that time, and Werner, who was Swiss and not involved in the politics of France, was nevertheless a person of the left. But as I say, none were doctrinaire. Well, that's me. It's hard for a journalist who has strong convictions about politics to suppress those convictions, because if you're an editor of the Washington Post or an editor of the New York Times, you should be impartial. But I'm also a citizen of the United States. Even though I live in Paris, I'm very active in politics. And I got pretty upset when the when George Bush's administration began assembling troops in Saudi Arabia, and I saw war coming. And with a bunch of friends there, we started a movement called Americans for Peace, and we joined in the French demonstrations. And there were as many as 100,000 Frenchmen on the streets of Paris. It was scarcely reported here. And that picture you're showing me was never seen in the United States. It was made by a wire service photographer, and it got back as far as New York, but to my knowledge was never published in the States, and our whole peace movement was unrecorded here. Yeah, I was strongly influenced by the pacifist movement of before World War II, and I was not at that time a member of a pacifist sect at all. After the war, I joined the Quakers, but in 1937, way back in college, I had led a student demonstration against war and fascism. The reason I was the leader was that the left couldn't agree among themselves who should lead, and I was chosen because I was on speaking terms with the other leaders. I was on the Daily Maroon, the student paper, and in effect, I guess I was a good front man for them. Robert M. Hutchins was the boy wonder, as he was called, when he became president of the University of Chicago at the age of 30. He had been the dean of the Yale Law School at 26, believe it or not. And I adored him. I mean, I got to know him personally. I saw him even in his later life after I left school. And I studied with him. I interviewed him for the student publications. He was just a great guy, and he recommended me to Henry R. Luce, that's of Time and the publisher of Time and Life, where I got a job in 1938 as an office boy, $20 a week, from 38 until 46, and in the 6 cities that I mentioned before. Well, that's an exclusive. It appears only in this book and in my archives at the University of Chicago. It's Ernest Hemingway on the left, and on the right is Elaine Fisher, known as Pinky, who was Robert Capa's English girlfriend in the spring of 1944. Capa had decided to have a big party for Hemingway in London. This was about a month before D-Day. And it lasted until the liquor ran out about 4 a.m. Hemingway landed in the hospital because he was offered a ride home by a doctor who immediately drove into a water tank. Hemingway went through the windshield and into the hospital. And 2 days later, Capa and Pinky went to see him. So Capa made this picture for Life magazine, which was published as a full page, but I kept the other one for myself. Yes, I met him. That was the night I met him, actually. We also saw each other at Mont Saint-Michel during the war, because after D-Day, 6 weeks later, I went off to Normandy myself. I just couldn't stand the idea of assigning photographers at their own peril day after day to cover combat, and I wanted to learn something about it. I had no real business going to Normandy, but I did, and I stayed there 4 weeks and worked with different photographers. One day Capa said to me, we were at First Army Press Camp with some very celebrated correspondents. Ernie Pyle was a tent mate. And one day Capa said, let's go to Mont Saint-Michel. We can stay there and cover the front from there. So we did, and Hemingway was already there, actually, with Bill Walton of Time. Well, that young man is one of a group who had shot at me about an hour before that. It's interesting to be shot at personally, especially if the shot misses. And I had been with Capa that day at an observation post at Saint-Malo, where a German garrison was holding out. And I got a little too curious and went to see where the fire was coming from. And a soldier took me, said, I'll show you. And he walked inland a block, ran across the street corner, and dropped behind a stone wall. He motioned me to follow him, which I did, and as I ran across this, there was a shot. He said, that's funny, that never happened before. And I said, well, yeah, it's pretty funny. And he said, when we go back, you'll have to run for it. And I said, you don't really have to tell me. So he went, and I went. And again, there was another shot. And it was only an hour or so later that they brought in this group of prisoners. And when I looked at when I made that photo myself, I thought, oh, you poor kid. It was hard to feel anything more than that. Well, I put that in the book because that's the first picture spread on the events of World War II, which we now call the Holocaust. The Holocaust was suppressed as a news story. It was well known that to Allied authorities on the highest level that things like this were going on in Germany and in the occupied territories. And those are shoes. This was taken by probably a Russian soldier at the liberation of the Polish camp called Majdanek, I guess it's called. And that was published in the Illustrated London News in October 1944, 9 months before the war ended. Life published a similar page about that time, way in the back of the magazine, called opposite a Campbell's soup ad. The New York Times has done a mea culpa on this. Abe Rosenthal wrote a sort of a mea culpa is the best expression for it, a statement for the New York Times Centennial exhibition at the New York Public Library, in which he talked about the fact that the Times itself had suppressed the news of the Holocaust, played it way inside, played it way down. So I just felt it worth recalling that because if the public had gotten excited about that through press coverage, maybe some lives would have been saved. I quit life, and when they sent me a check for severance pay, I thought I got indignant. I walked into my boss, Wilson Hicks, and said, "What's this all about? I wasn't fired. I quit." And he just laughed, but he persuaded me to accept it. In 1961, Magnum and I got kind of tired of each other, and I guess you could say I was fired, but it was a mutual thing, and I've continued working with Magnum as a freelance person. I started my own business with them and so on. I was really fired by the Washington Post. That's a curious story that you'll find in there. But I continue to be friends with Catherine Graham and Ben Bradley, and I've talked with them about that matter several times. And they indeed recommended me. I mean, the Post recommended me when I was considered for a similar job at the New York Times. Well, it was an offshoot of Catherine's decision to bring Ben Bradley over from Newsweek to the editorship of the Post, and that had a secondary effect, which I don't think Catherine expected. The number 2 person at the Post under Al Friendly, the managing editor, was a guy named Ben Gilbert, and he really got upset because he had expected to advance himself, and when Bradley was put over there, he saw that his career was going to quickly terminate, which it did in a couple of years. So Gilbert was the man I had worked with mostly as picture editor, and I was his easiest victim, and we had a confrontation one afternoon, and I said, "Ben, I'm not going to take this any longer." He said, "It's you or me. You're fired." I couldn't believe it. And I appealed all the way to Catherine Graham, who saw me at her home in Georgetown and very sympathetically talked with me for 3/4 of an hour, and finally shook her head sadly and said, "Well, Johnny, I'm afraid that we've hurt Ben Gilbert as much as we're going to hurt him. I guess it's goodbye." 14 months. Well, I went back to New York and got a job with my alma mater, Time Life. But as a book editor, I was assigned to do a book on a picture biography of Adolf Hitler, which was never published because I was offered a job at the New York Times. Eugene Smith took that picture in Haiti. It's a madman at a real snake pit on the outskirts of Port-au-Prince, which I had coincidentally seen as a tourist in 1953. I had gone there with my wife, and met a number of interesting Haitians, and one offered to take me to this insane asylum. This man was trying to dramatize, call the world's attention to the plight of the mentally ill in Haiti. And several years later, I heard that some New York pharmaceutical companies were going to build a modern mental clinic in Port-au-Prince. And I seized on that as a story idea for Magnum, and Eugene Smith got the assignment for Magnum to go and document the changes. And that's one of his strongest pictures from that story. Gene died on the 15th of October in 1978. I remember it so clearly because he had appointed me his executor. And he died on a Sunday. It was, in a way, you could say his death was long overdue. He had not been well for the previous year. And when I got the word on Sunday afternoon in New York, I flew to Tucson, and the next morning I was at the undertaker's and saw Gene's face for the last time. Yes, he was a disturbed man. He was a brilliant man, a passionate photographer. In a sense, you could call Gene the father of the modern photo essay. He's perhaps the most important photo essayist of our time. He did kind of fall apart in the 50s, but he had a great comeback in Japan with an essay that he did with his second wife, Eugene Smith, on Minamata and the victims of chemical pollution at Minamata, which is a city in the south of Japan. There's a photo in the book. It's a picture of a child whose name is Tomoko being bathed in her mother's arms. And it's a beautiful picture. Whenever Gene showed it and talked about it on the screen, he would tend to become very tearful indeed. And there's a picture in the book that shows Gene lecturing about that at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. That would have been about 1972, somewhere there. I'm not sure exactly. I was picture editor of the New York Times then, as I recall. Well, I fell in love with my college sweetheart. We had to wait 3.5 years to get married. It's funny that you mention that, because one reason I was able to do this book is I saved a lot of stuff. And one of the things I found in my files was a telegram I sent to my fiancée in Chicago the day after I reported for work as an office boy at Time Inc. in New York, 1938, because she was still in school. And my telegram said, "Start work in mailroom tomorrow. Saw Henry Luce. Love." And she was a saver also. She saved my letters that I wrote from London home. I had a son who was a year old before I ever saw him. There's not a great deal of my personal life in the book. I confined it largely to my professional life. She died many years ago. I've had 2 wives who died each after about 20 years. And I'm now married for the 3rd time to Tana Hoban, and I love that picture of the 2 of us. Tana is a photographer herself who has done over 50 books for children. There are not many photographers who've sold over 2 million books. And that's taken in the one window of my office in Paris. Yes, I can make a good argument for that, and that was even before Princess Diana died in a tunnel in Paris, supposedly escaping from the paparazzi a year ago. Unfortunately, press photographers have been blamed for her death, which is unjust, because she really died because she was in the hands of a drunken driver. But the reason I call Paris the capital of photojournalism is much more serious. With the death of the big picture magazines like Life and Look and others abroad, and there are no real picture magazines left in England. It's been the independent agencies who are largely headquartered in Paris who are responsible for covering the world. The wire services have done a good job too, but in terms of freelance magazine photography, the work comes out of photographers who work for agencies like not only Magnum, but Gamma, CSPAN, Sigma, Contact, View, etc. I've always fought to give photographers credit. I believe very strongly in that. And I persuaded the International Herald Tribune to give name credit to photographers in every instance. Well, Magnum had a lot to do with that, but Life magazine was very good about crediting photographers. That's where I got my training, and Life magazine was scrupulous about identifying the sources of pictures. That's one reason that Life is such a great historical resource. So that's really where it began. I had a big fight with the London press when I was London picture editor of Life during the war, because we resold pictures to London papers through picture magazines through AP. And the London papers had refused to credit. They treated photographers like dirt at the time. And so I insisted on credit, and as a result, one of the Fleet Street press newsletters, news magazines, published an article denouncing me as an American imperialist. Well, that's shorthand for a wonderful Turkish journalist. It's pronounced Sipa, and his name is Göksin, G-O-K-S-I-N, Sipokoglu. And he actually has a show on in Paris at this very moment. I just was at the opening last week. But Sipa is short for Sipokoglu. His own personal agency. He's a wonderful, charming guy whose fortunes go up and down like a roller coaster. Well, Nick was an AP stringer, perhaps a staff photographer, I guess, in Vietnam. And that picture, I happened to be picture editor of the New York Times. The day that picture came over the wire, the little girl is stark naked, of course, and I remember how the news editor at the Times was so happy that she hadn't yet begun to show, because it made it easier to run the picture on the front page of the Times. Well, Sigma, you see, Magnum began the use of one-word photo agency designations. So after Magnum, there was Gamma, was founded in about 1970, somewhat in imitation of Magnum. It was also a cooperative in the beginning. And then Gamma split in two, and the offshoot became Sigma, which became as much as powerful or more powerful than Gamma. And the one-word agency name is sort of a tradition now. That's a picture of the Gulf War by David Turnley, who's also made the cover picture. The soldier in that picture is crying because he's just discovered that the body bag on the right-hand side of the photo contains his best friend. And I've been always a very strong anti-war person, and I ran that picture not only because it's a good picture, but because it seems to me it kind of demonstrates the emptiness of victory. That war was considered an incredible victory on the part of the Allies, which it was. But there's so many died, and the devastation continued so long afterward. And that's a picture by Sebastião Salgado, a Brazilian photographer who has been in Magnum. He's now freelance. And it's in the aftermath of the explosion of the oil well fires in Kuwait. The man there is not dead, he's just knocked out. He's an oil worker who was knocked out in the process of trying to cap that well. But I ran that because it symbolizes the environmental impact of that war. We just got to find a better way to heal the conflicts in the world than war. I guess all the time, when you're an editor of the New York Times, you have to kind of suppress your personal feelings because you have to try to be objective. Eugene Smith, as a photographer, ridiculed objectivity. He said he was a passionate man, and he was a crusader who wanted his pictures to bring justice to the world. His name is Jack Hubbard, and he's now out in Stanford, but he was then on Cape Cod, on Martha's Vineyard. Scotty Rustin called me from Edgartown one morning. He said something curious has happened here. Ted Kennedy's car seems to be have run off a bridge, and I have some pictures of it, and I'm working on the story, but what should I do with the pictures? I said, well, just tell the photographer to wire them to us. I was then at the New York Times. Well, you could call it an execution. Eddie Adams, who took this picture and won a Pulitzer Prize for it, has always regretted taking it. It's curious, when General Lone died, Eddie wrote a sort of eulogy to Lone. He felt that he personally, through the publication of that picture, had ruined Lone's life. I don't feel that way. In fact, I wrote to Eddie, who was an old friend of mine, and said, get off it, Eddie. General Lone's act was inexcusable. War is inexcusable, but that particular act was inexcusable, and you shouldn't hold yourself responsible for that. Well, I sure did my best, and that succeeded. It came in before the early afternoon, the preliminary page 1 conference that day, and I didn't usually take pictures into that conference. But that day I took it in because I wanted to make sure that everybody would know it was there and that it would get used. So indeed it was. The only argument was how big, and another picture came in which kind of played with it nicely. Well, Clifton Daniel, on the right in the picture, was the man who hired me when he was managing editor of the New York Times, Margaret Truman's husband, and I had met him once before, but when he interviewed me, I never expected to go back to a newspaper after being fired by the Washington Post. And in fact, I said to the assistant managing editor who first asked me, you can't be serious. But they had, as I said, the Washington Post was very, in fact, Catherine herself has expressed regret that I ever left there. Anyway, Daniel asked me, what do you think of the way we play pictures in the New York Times? I said, I think it stinks. He said, so do I. So he hired me. And the other man is Abe Rosenthal, who quickly succeeded Daniel as managing editor, and under whom I worked for several years. He was tough. I have tremendous respect for Rosenthal, although he finally got tired of me too, and decided to make a change on the picture desk, which I didn't understand and never have. But that's the great New York Times building, 229 West 43rd Street, but the presses no longer roar in the basement. I think the New York Times is the world's greatest newspaper. I think it's the most conscientious. I'm not always happy with it. I am not happy with the job that the Times did and most of the press did on the Lewinsky matter. I think it went way out of balance, and I think the public has, in the recent elections, has demonstrated its judgment of that matter is far different from that of the initial judgment of the press. I put that picture in the book because I happened to be there. I was in Los Angeles on the day of the California primary in 1968. And, well, it's my one and only page 1 byline. I happened to be the only New York Times man who heard Bobby Kennedy's last words, because the real reporters were waiting for him to come through the pantry where he was shot and killed. And so when I heard the shots, and the ballroom cleared out, I got a phone backstage and got through to Times Rewrite in New York, and I was given Syl Fox, who was an excellent rewrite man. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough courage to dictate the lead the way I actually wanted to say it, and it's not as strong a story as it should be. I wanted to say that he had just been introduced by Jess Unruh as, quote, the next president of the United States, unquote, and everyone in that ballroom believed him. Right. That was a pretty funny interview. I was a good friend of Yoichi Okamoto, who had been the Lyndon Johnson's personal photographer. And Oki, as we called him, tried to help me get a job in the Carter White House. But and I went to see Jody Powell, but he said, "Oh, sure, the president is really interested in pictures. Why, Chip shoots pictures around here all the time." The son-in-law, the son, yeah, that's right, son. But as a result, I think Carter didn't come through as quite human a president as he deserved. I think his image was unfortunately cold. Oh, certainly they do. Again, that's what separates the quality papers from the sheep from the goats. I mean, the tabloids are shameless in doing that sort of thing. And pictures do indeed make editorial points subconsciously, but sometimes those points are the strongest. Well, sometimes the person does it for you. You take that same front page that shows the Eddie Adams Saigon execution picture. There's a portrait, there's a one-column picture of Richard Nixon there looking like a fool on the other side of the page. And the reason that picture is there is that that's the day he announced for the presidency, that he would campaign for it. But the picture came from his campaign headquarters. It was his so-called campaign portrait. I think he looks like, I was not a fan of Nixon's, but I must say I was pleased that I was just as happy as not to run that rather stupid picture of him. It was the reason for running it, of course, was it was the campaign picture. But I also think picture editing has improved, has become much more sensitive. At the time I joined the New York Times in 1967, it was the custom for the second edition to simply get from the morgue pictures, one-column cuts of people who were in the news, and it didn't really much matter to the late editors then whether the picture was showed one expression or another. As they called it, we have to cover this page. You can't get away with that much anymore. You have to show a picture that's relevant to the day's news. Well, I knew Joe in London. He was the correspondent for the New Yorker. A.J. Liebling, right. Well, he was interested more in food than in anything else, but he was delightful. He was amusing. I didn't know him terribly well, but he was one of, there were 1,000 correspondents accredited for the invasion of Europe. I mean, only a handful that you remember, but there were so many. I mean, that's one thing that's very disturbing. The numbers of the press have become a terrible problem. Look at the mob of photographers, reporters, cameramen, soundmen you see outside a courtroom. I mean, how can you get good coverage in such circumstances? Schauer, I knew not so much during the war, but after the war, when a group of writers in New York were fighting McCarthy, and Bill Schauer and John Hersey and Arthur Miller and a number of others met together. Well, she's a great woman, Lee Miller, whom I met in London when she was a Vogue photographer, and her photographs have now become rather celebrated. Thanks to her son, she's has exhibitions all over the world right now in New Zealand. That's Lee Miller by Man Ray, and she had such a gorgeous body that even her parts became celebrated. Man Ray did a study of her lips. Her breasts were inspired some champagne glasses. She was an incredible woman. To me, she was a hostess and friend, and she was having an affair with Dave Sherman, a life photographer, which was celebrated at the time. We all knew it. And but she cooked Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner for me in London in 1943. Well, Man Ray was originally came from Philadelphia. And he was an American expatriate in Paris who became famous as a photographer and artist. I'm sorry to say I never took the trouble to go and see him at his studio. But Lee Miller worked for him and was a lover of Man Ray's for a while. And she accidentally, in the darkroom, by turning the lights on when she wasn't supposed to, invented a technique they called solarization of prints. It means a kind of an overexposed print. I'm not very good at explaining technical terms. That's from a Swedish photographer named Leo Lundbrink, who came to see me in New York. After Magnum, I was syndicating pictures, trying to get picture stories placed in newspapers throughout the country. And Leo had he'd done something exceptional in Vietnam. He'd gone out with the South Vietnamese intelligence forces and interrogating prisoners, and this is the way they used to do it. It was a pretty brutal picture, and very few newspapers would publish that picture. The Toronto Star did, I think the New York Herald Tribune did, but the Washington Post bought the story and then killed it. Well, I was to have a meeting with Pierre Salinger at the White House. Magnum photographers were doing a book on the first 100 days of the Kennedy administration. Simultaneously, Nelson Rockefeller began tooling up to campaign against Kennedy for president in '64. And his public relations people advised him to go out in the streets of Albany and do a little talking to voters. So Elliot Irwood of Magnum got the assignment to go up there and shoot this. And he noticed this little, Elliot is big on dogs, and when I saw the contact sheet, I saw those 3 pictures, and I just howled, and I made up prints, took them to Salinger, who indeed, he jumped up from his desk, came back 5 minutes later, and said, "I just gave the boss the biggest laugh he's had since we came here." Well, that's Jackie Kennedy wheeling John in the White House grounds at that same time. And down below is Fidel Castro standing at the Bay of Pigs looking defiant. That picture of Castro was taken after the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion. He was triumphant, of course, and he returned to the scene with a few people from the press, and both of those are Magnum pictures. Oh boy. The biggest news night of my life, and anybody's, the happiest news night that I can ever remember, was the landing on the moon. And because it was such a totally positive story for the whole world. It was something that everything went right. Abe Rosenthal had brilliantly prepared us to cover that story. In 1954, just after Bob Capa was killed in Indochina, we met in Paris, and we had terrible problems. Magnum could have easily fallen apart then. The thing that rescued us was that Henri Cartier-Bresson, our French member, got a visa to go to Russia, and he came back with a series of pictures which were just extraordinary. Not in a news sense, but in terms of the everyday life of the Russians. And by this time, his prestige was such that I had 3 major magazines bidding for the story: Life, Look, and Holiday. And I sold a 2-part series to Life for $40,000. And Ed Thompson, the managing editor, said, "John, what do you see for a cover?" And I was ready for him, because I knew the Life logotype would fit nicely on that picture. So I proposed that, and he said, "Fine." That's by Bert Glynn of Magnum, and I think it's a hell of a picture. Covering the Khrushchev visit to America was a madhouse. I mean, that was the first example I can think of really total saturation of the press. There were so many photographers in the Iowa cornfield that Khrushchev visited, for example. You could hardly see Khrushchev. But in any event, it was a picture by Bert Glynn, who was alive and well and living in New York. I hope so. Oh, sure. I'm very active in politics. I was a delegate to one of the 2 political conventions, and the last time was not the Republican. From France. Democrats overseas are well organized. We have Democrats Abroad has chapters in many countries, and France is one of the largest and most active.